Welcome to Post Colonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and I'm here today to talk a bit about ideology. So I just realized that I just recently recorded a lecture on ideology in Marx and in the Marxist thought, and I realized that I didn't have an English version of it available, so I thought I should render that lecture on ideology in English as well. Now, in my several lectures on Althusser and everyone else, I have occasionally discussed this concept, but I thought I should have a specific video on it. So today I will introduce ideology in Marxian and Marxist sense. So if you read Marx, and especially his theorization of class and the proletariat, the kind of idea of ideology or a dominant ideology that Marx theorizes is what we call the epistemological model. And what does that mean? Epistemology is the philosophy and science of knowing, right? How do we know things? A study of that. So epistemological model of ideology then relies on a definition of ideology which questions what we know and how we know it. And as it applies in Marx to the working classes and proletariat, Marx's argument there is that in any given society there is a dominant ideology perpetuated by a superstructure or top, and most of the times those who are in the working classes tend to see the world through that dominant ideology. So ideology in that sense is this veil that hides the reality from the workers, right? That's why it's epistemological, because it's about knowledge. And the purpose of a revolutionary movement or act is to undo that veil, to remove it so that the workers can see the world from the point of view of their own self-interest, get to know of their own exploitation, and hence change the world. That's the epistemological model of ideology. So if you're going to use that, then you always can read a novel, a short story, and a text and see what is the dominant ideology and who is seeing the world from that point of view, and maybe mobilize a worker-centric ideology in opposition to that. Now, the problem in using that model in contemporary times is that we are post-Lacan, post-post structuralist movement. The idea of the real itself has become problematic. How? I mean, if you think, is there any way we can access the real? And we realize the real is also discursively produced, even ideologically produced, right? So there is no way we can lift one veil and expose the real lived conditions to a person. So that's where Louis Althusser's work comes in. Althusser was a structuralist Marxist. By that, what he means is that he studies the larger structures, but he also theorizes ideology using Lacan's concept of subjectivity and the big other and all those other concepts. So in his essay, Ideological and Repressive State Apparatuses, there are a few things that he revises in Marx. Now, in Marx, the state is always an oppressive institution, but Althusser suggests that sometimes the state works through ideological state apparatuses. It's not always repressive, and that he's taking from Antonio Gramsci's definition of dominance and hegemony, right? And there is a footnote in that essay where he acknowledges that. Now, if we look at that model of ideology, there are certain things that Althusser proposes, that ideology has no history. That means that you can't trace it from history. It exists where it is, right? We are in it. We are all born subjects in ideology, right? So that means that there is no outside to ideology. All we can do is move from one ideology to another. So the idea of making workers' consciousness of their own exploitation would then be to move them from a capitalist-centric ideology to a workerist-centrist ideology, right? But they will be moving from one ideology to another, because for Althusser, what ideology does is it makes the world intelligible to us. What does he mean by it? That any ideology that we inhabit, we read the world according to it. We understand the world according to it. So, for example, let's say if you're a socialist, right, and believe that the state should take care of its citizens, when you look at the private enterprises in the community and you look at how the healthcare system works, that will come across to you as wrong because it's not naturally wrong, but your ideology is that healthcare should not be expensive, that you shouldn't have to pay for it, that it is a right, that the state should provide it. Now, it's that ideology that is enabling to read a certain policy which other peoples who are outside that ideology might find absolutely okay. So that's how we use ideology to make the world intelligible to ourselves. I'm not going to go into the deeper details of Althusser's discussion because it will then get very long, but there is another concept that he theorizes through Lacan, and that is interpolation. And interpolation is when ideology hails you, right, or someone instituted or constituted by ideology hails you, and you immediately become aware of your own subjectivity. You become aware of who you are. So he famously uses the example of the policeman. Hey, you. And the moment you are addressed, you turn around and you see that you've been addressed by the law. That fixes you in your own identity. You understand what's your position in that system of power. Now, why does Althusser theorize this is because he is trying to answer two questions in that essay. The essay, Ideological and Repressive State Apparatuses. And one is that he says that every capitalistic society has to do two things. One, it must reproduce itself. And two, it must constantly produce commodities. Right? So that we already clearly understand that every capitalistic society must produce commodities to trade. Right? But how does it reproduce itself? Like, especially in a democratic system where no one can be told this is your position by birth, this is who you will always be, right? Your father was a carpenter, you will be a carpenter too. And what he's saying is the state doesn't mandate that. It doesn't force people to do certain jobs. The educational system as an ideological state apparatus creates human subjectivities that fill different gaps at different levels of the capitalistic venture. Think of it, American K-12 system. If you have a 10th grade education, you already know, 12th grade education, you already know what jobs you qualify for. You won't even think of applying to jobs that, require a high school diploma. Then you go to college. Depending on what degree you get, it decides for you what career path will you take, what would be the limit of your aspirations. Now, we're not talking about exceptions, but by and large, the educational system, because of attrition at different levels, creates these human bodies who go and fill different places within the machine of capital. And repeatedly, this educational system then constantly reproduces its class hierarchies, its job specializations, and each person in it then is constituted by the very ideology of the education, which forces them to think that this is the limit of my potential, this is what I can do with my life. So that's Althusser. Now, a more expansive discussion of this concept is available in chapter 1 of my book on ISIS. I'll post a link to the book in the description, but by and large, these are the two major ways of looking at ideology in Marxism. Okay, the epistemological model in Marx, where ideology is a false consciousness that must be removed. And the solution to that was some kind of vanguardist approach from Lenin. The party was supposed to come and enable the workers to learn. If you go through dialectics, then education, critical pedagogy was supposed to do that. And then there is the Althusserian model, where each one of us is born in ideology. Ideology is the mode through which we understand the world. We are all already subjects, and that ideology mostly works through ideological state apparatuses. Now, how do you use it? I mean, you can use the earlier model that I discussed to look at the general ideology of a text. Within that, the specific ideologies of the characters that they inhabit. Do they come to consciousness? How? Or you can use the Althusserian model to read any text to see which particular ideology a certain human subject inhabits. And because of that, what possible actions do they perform? And then in order to change their perception of the world, their way of looking at the world, and the way of acting in the world, how would it be possible to shift them from one ideology to another, because there is no outside to ideology? So these are some of the ways in which you can use these. I hope this explains a little bit. If I have missed anything or I have not explained anything well enough on this topic, please do let me know in the comments. And as always, I'm really grateful for your presence in my life, and please do take care, and I will now see you next time. Until then, peace and love.